Hello, my name is Clive Johnson, and I'm an interfaith minister, a writer, a house sitter, and just about anything else I can find to use my time. Based in the UK, which is where I first discovered the Labyrinth around about 12 years ago when I was living in the city of Brighton and Hove on the south coast. And I just stumbled into a beautiful Gothic church there one uh, bright May evening. There was a candlelit labyrinth walk in progress, and I was totally taken by the whole event and very quickly became a regular walker. I trained just about a year and a half ago with Kay and Catherine down in Houston. Um, and I describe my work with the Labyrinth as being a ministry. Um, I don't fully understand the scope of that ministry. It's something which has evolved and I'm sure will continue to evolve over time. But the main emphasis in recent months has been with a project called Labyrinth Around America, which really began actually during the time of the training down in Houston. And I was very inspired by what I heard other people were doing and the work they were doing with the Labyrinth at that time. That especially included Catherine's work in Florida, which was a real inspiration for me. Um, and I just had a real strong feeling that I should undertake this crazy project, which is to take a canvas labyrinth all around the border states of the USA. I started in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, where my labyrinth was made last April, and so far have visited 25 states. So heading in a clockwise direction, I routed over towards Massachusetts initially, and then later in the year came back and came down the East Coast, and more recently have just finished a stage between Jacksonville and New Orleans. um, so I started this project on the back of a feeling, and that's the way it's continued, a leading, if you like. My initial idea was that it would provide a way for people in different communities to connect simply by the action of walking the same labyrinth that ultimately would be making this journey encircling the whole country, at least the whole of the mainland. Um, at the same time, I thought there would be opportunities to introduce the labyrinth to people who perhaps were unaware of it, which certainly has happened. Um, but actually, this journey's taken on a much wider purpose beyond which I understand. I quite quickly came to realize that the labyrinth can be used in circumstances beyond what for me was a fairly familiar setting, which was a scheduled walk, um, carefully facilitated, usually with some presentation or introduction, and organized over a certain set period of time. So that had been my what I personally had been most used to, particularly in church settings. But I quickly learned that Labyrinth has a power of its own. It has a lot of mysteries that it holds that we will probably never fully understand. It seems to have an energy of its own when it's actually laid out. So in a sense, it doesn't almost matter if nobody is walking it. I will always, when I'm facilitating, walk around the periphery, around the edge of the labyrinth, and I have a routine when I'm doing that to recite a prayer, the loving kindness prayer, which you may be familiar with. May all beings be happy, at peace, free of suffering, healed, know their wholeness, dwell in the heart. So that's a prayer that works in any tradition, not just in Christian tradition. In fact, it's a prayer that the form of words comes from the Buddhist tradition, I believe. And it can also apply for people who don't have any faith, so it has a wonderful intentionality about it as well. And that really was one of the intentions of this ministry, was to be fully inclusive, not to just restrict the Labyrinth to people from a particular background, and hopefully to introduce it to as many different people as possible. So as a result of that, I've been in not just in places of worship, but in libraries, in public parks, in an art gallery, in a prison, in schools, on the National Mall, for example. There have been many, many opportunities to take the Labyrinth to different places and introduce it to different people, different communities. So, as I was saying, I think this journey has started to take on a purpose beyond which I fully understand. And one aspect of that is connecting with nature. I think that the Labyrinth can play a healing role for the land, for the environment, for trees, for plants, for animals, just simply by being laid out in a particular place. I've also learned that the finger labyrinth, which I take with me on the journey, can serve that purpose too. And I use that as a kind of focus for prayer, a kind of an anchoring point where I can pray for a particular area, a place where I am. And of course, finger labyrinth can sit on your lap. It can be taken on subway trains, as it has been in New York, for example. It can be laid out on street corners, as I have done in DC, for example. And I've learned that also has a power beyond just, I say just, it has a very tremendous power as a tool for walking in a sitting mode, or just using your finger as well. In terms of facilitating, I suppose my style is pretty much as was taught by Viriditas. I've evolved that over time. It does depend on the particular context that I'm in. Sometimes I will be with people who are very familiar with the Labyrinth, for example, who probably don't want to know very much about the history and the very basics of approaching the Labyrinth. I think one thing which is difficult to teach is in facilitating is the vital role of holding, and that is something which is done in silence. It is for me a prayerful activity. It is being mindful of what's happening within the Labyrinth without being intrusive, without paying obviously too much close attention to what people are doing in terms of being in their space, as it were. So having a sort of peripheral vision and awareness. And I think that starts with preparation. When the Labyrinth is being laid out, it's about asking for what for me is the divine or God's presence and work to be done in that particular place, and to draw the people that are meant to be there, and to touch them in the way that they're meant to be touched. It's certainly not about numbers. This isn't a game as such. It's not like a corporate exercise. If nobody comes to the Labyrinth, that's not a problem for me. It's been laid out, it's done its work in that area. I believe it's touched people who are in that community, even if they've not come and walked it. And certainly that's been the case when I've had the Labyrinth in public places. People quite often haven't had time to walk, but they've passed by, they've taken a flyer, they've shown some interest. I've no idea whether they will go on to look at a website or actually seek out another labyrinth, but at least they've been introduced to the concept. And even those people that don't, for example, when I was in Brooklyn, the labyrinth was laid out on a large sidewalk in one of the main parks in the centre of Brooklyn, Cadman Plaza. And people were just walking across it, sometimes jogging across it, not even noticing that they were going across a labyrinth. It was perhaps for them public artwork or something. I believe that the labyrinth has some effect at a sort of subconscious level for anybody that comes into contact with it. So definitely not about numbers. And of course, generally speaking, as a facilitator, you never know unless somebody specifically takes time to feed back to you, which quite often they do, what their experience has been. It may be many days, many weeks, many months, or even years later that the impact of their experience becomes clear. And for most people, that is a private moment, is a private experience. So I just trust that the people who are walking will have the experience that they're meant to have. I was one of them 12 years ago. I don't think I said a word to the folks who were facilitating that particular event, albeit I now know them very well and they know that that was my first experience, but certainly I could have just walked away and they would never have known. So we're all on our own journey, and that's really one of the great beauties of the Labyrinth, I think. So I wish you well with your training. I wish you well with the work that you will find to do, your ministry, if you will, and send you every blessing.